It gives rise to this perception that you're influencing public policy, and then legislators are beholden to special interests and not acting necessarily in the interests of all their constituents.
Hi, fellow Virginians. It's day one. Let's get to work.
On this episode of Pod Virginia,
corruption in the Commonwealth.
Virginia ranks 43rd in the new State Campaign Finance Index from the Coalition for Integrity.
We've got Shruti Shah on the show. She's the president of the Coalition for Integrity.
If you don't have any rules and if you don't enforce any rules, it's so much easier to be corrupt.
She'll explain why Virginia always ranks so horribly low on all of their indexes and why that continues to be a problem.
We'll also talk about that Supreme Court decision overturning the right to have an abortion and ask what's next for Virginia.
We will protect the rights of women.
Plus, Republicans choose Prince William Supervisor Yesli Vega to go up against incumbent Democrat Abigail Spanberger in the 7th Congressional District.
And in the 2nd Congressional District of Virginia Beach, they chose Senator Jen Kiggans to go up against incumbent Democrat Elaine Luria.
And I will fight to bring prices down by ending Joe Biden's reckless spending and holding government accountable.
On this episode of Pod Virginia.
Stick around.
As many as favor that motion will say aye. Those opposed, no. The motion is agreed to.
I'm Michael Pope.
I'm Thomas Bowman.
And this is Pod Virginia, where stare decisis means more than yesterday's newspaper.
Later in the show, we're joined by Shruti Shah of the Coalition for Integrity. She's going to explain how Virginia's lackadaisical laws on campaign finance open the door to at least perceived corruption.
But first, let's get to the news. Abortion is no longer a right guaranteed by the United States Constitution now that the Supreme Court has overturned Roe v. Wade. That puts the Virginia General Assembly in the spotlight because Virginia now has the power to bring back a ban on abortion, which it had from 1846 to 1973. Now, Governor Glenn Youngkin is calling for a ban on most abortions after 15 weeks. And he's putting together a group of 4 Republican lawmakers to make sure it happens. Senator Siobhan Dunavant, Senator Steve Newman, Delegate Kathy Byron, and Delegate Margaret Ransone. Here's Senator Newman on WDBJ shortly after the Supreme Court announcement.
The governor has put forward a bill that talks about making sure that those infants, those children that are feeling pain at 15 weeks are not aborted. I'm hopeful that people on both sides of the aisle will be able to support that measure.
Now, Senator Newman might be hopeful that members on both sides will support that measure, but Senate Democrats are already signaling they'll do everything possible to block it. Here's Senator Cree Deeds on WDBJ.
I would anticipate that we're going to stand strong as we have in the past, and we will protect the rights of women to make their own health care decisions in Virginia.
So you hear there Senator Deeds say Senate Democrats will stand strong and protect the rights of women, but that protection is hanging by a thread because Democrats have a paper-thin majority, a 1-vote majority in the state Senate, and they've got an anti-abortion Democrat in the caucus. So they've actually got to go through some procedural mumbo-jumbo to make sure that doesn't happen. Earlier this year, for example, Delegate Nick Freitas had a bill that would have required medical professionals provide treatment and care to infants born alive after a botched abortion. That bill actually bounced around a bit from the Health and Ed Committee to the Rules Committee in an effort to make sure it never came to the Senate floor. That's a move Senate Republicans call a committee merry-go-round. So, Thomas, abortion is clearly going to be a huge issue when the General Assembly meets again. Republicans want this 15-week ban. I think they're probably willing to negotiate to a 20-week ban. What do we make of the future of the possibility that that abortion might be outlawed in Virginia?
Well, I actually don't think that's really going to happen, but it's absolutely on the ballot. And part of the reason for that is I don't think even the Republicans in the majority would have all the votes of their own caucus members if it were truly something they could do. But let's be real here. There's no scientific evidence that non-viable fetal pain is a thing, Michael. There's tons of evidence, however, that full-grown people who are denied abortions are royally screwed. They're 3 times more likely to end up below the federal poverty line after just 2 years. And living, breathing women go through hell when they can't get a legal abortion. That's real pain. And Michael, when it comes to elections, a recent Roanoke College poll published June 3rd found that 88% of Virginians agree that abortion should be legal, at least in some capacity, which is up from 77% just 7 years ago. So only 11%, according to this poll, of Virginians believe abortion should be completely illegal. So, Michael, the governor is trying to split hairs, and Republicans are trying to push some emotional whataboutisms that are just based on absolutely junk science.
You know, going back to the politics of what might happen in the state Senate, so like that's the real roadblock for any kind of abortion measures is the state Senate. And, you know, the Senate Democrats have this anti-abortion member of their caucus, Senator Joe Morrissey. But there's a little bit of nuance there, because if you think about this most recent special session for the budget, there was a budget amendment from the governor that they were considering that would outlaw any state funding for abortion. So right now, if you're a low-income woman, you can get state funding for an abortion. And Governor Youngkin and the Republicans were trying to block that. It actually went to the Senate floor, of course, because it was a budget amendment. And so Morrissey voted with the Democrats to block that amendment. So it's not just sort of straight up or down the way that you might expect. Nevertheless, if something gets to the Senate floor, you know, we don't really know what Morrissey might do. He kind of holds all the cards here in terms of making the decision one way or the other. And of course, Winsome Sears, the lieutenant governor, is really eager to break the tie and get her name on this as well. So, I mean, the real sort of procedural stuff to watch here on the fetal pain bill, the 15-week ban or possibly the 20-week ban, would be, does it get to the Senate floor? So do you think that Senate Democrats would be able to block anything getting to the floor, or can you see some kind of scenario where it does get to the Senate floor?
Who's to say, Michael? I mean, there's always possibilities. There's a million ways this could go. But I also see that this is a real opportunity for corporations to get involved, specifically because this policy would often threaten some of the benefits, the healthcare benefits that make them competitive, at least that make them competitive operating in this state. So I think about the CEO of Dick's, Lauren Hobart. She put out a statement on LinkedIn right after the decision came out. She said, "At Dick's, our teammates are the heart of our business, and we're committed to protecting their health and well-being. Today, the Supreme Court announced a decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, blah, blah, blah. While we do not know what decision each state will make in response to this ruling, we at Dick's Sporting Goods are prepared to ensure that all of our teammates have consistent and safe access to the benefits we provide, regardless of the state in which they live." So they've announced that if a state one of their teammates lives in restricts access to abortion, Dick's Sporting Goods is going to provide up to $4,000 in travel expense reimbursement to travel to the nearest location where that care is legally available. So, Michael, if you're one of those people who think that big business has too much influence in Virginia, well, guess what? This is a golden opportunity for those big businesses to use that influence on an issue that 88% of Virginians support.
It certainly ups the ante for whatever might happen in the 2023 election, where all 100 members of the House will be on the ballot and all 40 members of the state Senate will be on the ballot. We'll really see the future of the politics around abortion in that election. But, you know, Thomas, we've got another election to get through first, which is the 2022 election. So also in the news, voters in 5 congressional districts selected candidates for this fall's election. And we now have a clear picture of who will be on the ballot this November. So let's start with the 7th congressional district, where Prince William Supervisor Yesli Vega will be going up against incumbent Democrat Abigail Spanberger. The morning after Vega won that Republican primary, she appeared on Fox and Friends, where else, right? Fox and Friends, to talk about her campaign, starting with crime.
Unfortunately, you have a Democrat Party that has opened up the doors for crime skyrocketing in our communities like we've never seen before. You have somebody in Abigail Spanberger that led the charge to end qualified immunity, has taken money from AOC's Defund the Police Pact, and that's something that we're going to remind voters every single step of the way. And we're going to ensure that we do our very best to provide that safety that voters so desperately want.
So Vega is not just a county supervisor. She's also a sheriff's deputy and the daughter of Salvadoran immigrants. And she frames her own origin story as a candidate as a reaction against MS-13. As a member of the Board of Supervisors, she supported the controversial 287G program, which allowed county officials there in Prince William to carry out federal immigration law. That program was championed by Corey Stewart, and the program was terminated by the local jail board in the summer of 2020. So, Thomas, the politics here are complicated by the fact that you've got a woman who is, the daughter of Salvadoran immigrants. She's got law enforcement sort of background, and, she wants to campaign against crime. And we'll hear later inflation and gas prices and the economy. What do you make of this race here between Yesli Vega and Abigail Spanberger?
Well, it's going to be a tough race, no matter who the nominee was, but especially somebody with that kind of background. Spanberger is generally not well known in the new part of her district in Prince William County and Stafford, and where a lot of these Democratic voters would be. So it's going to be a tight race no matter what. But having Latino on the ballot really helps Republicans in this area because there's a lot of Latino population, as we found out with Chaz Netticombe last week. And, immigration being something that Republicans harp on is actually kind of an easy one for a lot of Republican Latino candidates to also harp on, because there's a pretty significant undercurrent of resentment for legal immigrants who don't like that some people are, in their opinion, trying to skip the line. There's a lot of nuance with that really broad statement, Michael, but that is a key recurring factor in why some Latinos side with the Republicans on immigration.
Yeah, and if you think about Winsome Sears becoming the first, African-American woman to be lieutenant governor, that's something that, of course, Democrats wanted to have their person be the first lieutenant governor of color. And instead, the Republicans got that. And, I'm sure supporters of Yesli Vega would also want to have a Republican be the first Latina to represent Virginia in Congress. So I think we're definitely going to hear a lot about that during the campaign. Vega is also hoping to frame her campaign around a discussion of inflation and gas prices and the economy in free fall. She also said this on Fox and Friends.
We're in the position that we're in because of Joe Biden's positions on policy and Abigail Spanberger supporting him every single step of the way. And when I'm at the gas pump, I talk to voters. When I'm at the grocery store, I talk to voters, and everybody is feeling the squeeze, whether it's at the pump or at the dairy aisle at the grocery store. And I'm reminding people that there is a possibility that we can change and turn things around. And it starts with opening their minds, opening their hearts, and giving us the opportunity to talk to them about why we're in the best position to represent them the way that they deserve to be represented.
The gas pump and the dairy aisle, is that going to be the downfall for Democrats in 2022?
It tends to be. It's always about the economy in elections. And any Democrat who tries to run on this economy is going to get absolutely toasted. Even if they can hold on to their reelection, they're going to lose the support and the legitimacy of a lot of their base because, hey, Democrats historically represent people who are down on their luck or people who are marginalized. They don't represent rich people. That's the Republican Party. So if the Republican Party, who generally represents rich people, can sing the song of people who are feeling this pinch, which is all of us, Vega is absolutely correct, then that going to bode very well for them to get back, because people are separating. Just look at what happened with Youngkin. People are separating Donald Trump from other Republicans in the Republican Party.
Yeah. This congressional district voted for Biden in 2020 with a 6.7% margin of victory for Biden, 6.7. So that is, would be good for Democrats in, an ordinary year, but this is not an ordinary year. And if the economy drags down Democrats in this, 2022, this could be an indication of a wave election, right? I mean, this could be one of the first seats that we hear about on election night in terms of, if this one flips, we're probably going to see a whole lot of districts across the country flip, and the House, might go to Republicans. That's if the election is about the economy. It might end up being about Trump and the insurrection, and
they don't want to talk about abortion or January 6th. So if you're a Democrat, that's what you want to sit there and talk about, is the Republicans trying to outlaw abortion and January 6th and all of the stuff that goes with that. And by the way, the people who endorsed Vega, as far as the national names go, include Jenny Thomas. These are people who are being subpoenaed or asked to testify by the January 6th committee. So these are probably not the best friends to have.
Yeah, Vega did secure a lot of big names to get that nomination, including Ted Cruz, Ken Cuccinelli, Bob Good, and you mentioned Jenny Thomas. I mean, Jenny Thomas, of course, finds herself in the crosshairs of this investigative committee. And so will that drag down Vega as the committee continues making revelations? We don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see on that. And speaking of the 1-6 committee, it also plays in the other congressional primary that happened last week, the one over in the 2nd congressional district in the Hampton Roads area, where State Senator Jen Kiggans defeated 3 other Republicans to secure the Republican nomination. First elected in 2019, Kiggans filled the seat of longtime Senator Frank Wagner. In the Senate, Kiggans has championed things like an unsuccessful bid to ban inherently divisive concepts from the classroom. We've talked about that a couple times on this podcast. She also supported an unsuccessful budget amendment to spend $70 million to audit the 2020 election. They didn't want to audit the 2021 election, but they wanted to spend $70 million to audit the 2020 election in Virginia. So here's part of the Kiggans victory speech after she won the nomination.
Joe Biden was inaugurated in January 2020. And since that time, America has stumbled from one crisis to another. We faced record gas prices, inflation, supply chain shortages, open borders, high crime, and foreign policy failures in Afghanistan and the Ukraine. It doesn't have to be this way. These problems are a direct result of the failed leadership of Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Elaine Luria. No issue is more important right now than restoring America's economic strength. Joe Biden has made America's economy weaker than at any time since the 1970s. He shut down the Keystone Pipeline and ended new drilling on federal land. So now our economy is threatened by record high gas prices that are nearing $5 a gallon. Joe Biden pushed through trillions in spending while downplaying the risk of inflation. And now inflation is higher now than at any time in the last 40 years, and families are struggling to put food on the table and to keep up with basic expenses. Our older adults and our veterans are living on fixed incomes and being devastated by inflation. We must restore America's economic strength, and I will fight to bring prices down by ending Joe Biden's reckless spending and holding government accountable.
So you hear Jen Kiggans doing her level best there to frame this entire campaign about the economy, about gas prices, about inflation. We're going to hear Republicans try to make the entire campaign about all of those issues. But this race, though, in particular, has a wild card, which is Elaine Luria is a member of the 1-6 committee, and Thomas, she is about to have a starring role in the key presentation where she is going to be delivering, as in her role as a member of the 1-6 committee, she is going to be delivering the presentation on what Trump was doing the day of the insurrection and what his whereabouts were the day of all the events at the Capitol. And so that you might end up really changing the dynamics of this particular campaign in a way that would never happen in the 7th congressional district or many other districts, because, Luria is going to she's going to seem like a prosecutor, really going after Trump in particular. So meanwhile, Kiggans voted for the $70 million audit. And, on the campaign trail, she has repeatedly declined to say that Biden was legitimately elected. And so, as you heard in her victory speech there, she's going to want to talk about the economy, but I think she's going to have a lot of questions about January 6th.
Yeah. And Michael, I just want to push back on some of the things that were in Kiggans' victory speech. So she mentioned Afghanistan and Ukraine. Well, Donald Trump actually got impeached for trying to blackmail Ukraine and extort their leader there. In Afghanistan, the order to withdraw from Afghanistan was actually issued by Donald Trump, and then they had to do it because it wasn't in the next budget. The supply chain problems, of course, we do have Trump's failure to contain COVID, leading to a global outbreak that has caused acute pain in the supply chain. But before COVID, Trump-era tariffs made things more expensive for everybody. So when this January 6th committee really unveils what's going on, by the way, and it is doing so currently, we know that Trump's calls that the election was rigged are absolutely false. He knew they were false. People around him were telling him they were false. And he's opened himself up to significant legal exposure. And Michael, I'm going to make a prediction, in a prediction I do not normally make. Donald Trump will be indicted in or by September of this year, when people are tuning back into the elections, when they're home from their summer vacations, if they got to take one. That is when it's going to happen.
One thing that I've been following the January 6th committee, it's fascinating, all of the details that are emerging as a result of this congressional investigation. We'll, of course, have to see what the Department of Justice ends up doing with that. One piece of information that has yet to come out that I'm super curious about is the scaffolding and the noose that was erected on the Capitol grounds. Thomas, who erected that scaffolding? Who put that noose there? We don't know the answer to that question yet, but I'm curious about how that got there and who put it there. There's got to be security footage around that area, right? I mean, that's a piece of this puzzle that we don't currently know, that I think might end up changing things, or at least being a detail that will be shocking when we find out the answer to that. Maybe it might not be, but maybe it will be. Meanwhile, you've got Elaine Luria, who will be personally unveiling all kinds of details about Donald Trump and what Donald Trump was doing on that day. So I think, the economy and gas prices and what's happening at the dairy aisle, and that's all really important stuff. And Kiggans is going to want to make the campaign about that, but she might be overtaken by events here in terms of what happens with this January 6th committee.
Yeah. All I'll say is be very careful who you make your bed with.
So now, one other thing I want to point out about this congressional district is that Biden won it in 2020, but the margin of victory here was so low. It was only 1.7. This is a Biden 1.7 district. So if there's any kind of swing to the right, this is one of the first districts to go down. So there's going to be a whole lot of focus here on this particular district across the country. People are going to be focused on this district.
And friend of the podcast, Chaz Nuttycombe, does have this district as leans Republican, and he hasn't changed that based off who the nominee is.
We'll definitely have to watch that as the election season unfolds. So stick around to Pod Virginia, because we are definitely going to be talking about this race again.
Okay, guys. Well, let's take a break. We'll get to the main event. When we come back, we'll be joined by Shruti Shah at the Coalition for Integrity, and she's going to explain why Virginia gets a failing grade for campaign finance laws and what should we be doing about it. We'll be right back.
This is Skylar Van Valkenburg, delegate from Henrico County, and you're listening to Pod Virginia, my favorite podcast with Michael Pope and Thomas Bowman.
And we're back on Pod Virginia. It's time to talk about corruption. Now, Virginia has a problem with corruption. Just ask Phil Hamilton of Newport News. He was, at one time, one of the most powerful members of the House of Delegates. He ended up spending 8 years in prison for inserting provisions into the state budget in exchange for a job at Old Dominion University.
Good gig if you can write it into the budget, Michael. Or former House Transportation Committee Chairman Ron Villanueva, who spent 2 years in prison for defrauding the federal government.
Or you could also ask former Governor Bob McDonnell, who is kind of like the poster child for corruption.
I think I remember hearing something about that. Remind me about it?
Well, let me tell you, Thomas, he befriended a wealthy businessman by the name of Johnny Williams, who wanted regulators to help him sell a snake oil product called Anatablock, which was an anti-inflammatory made with synthetic tobacco. So he showered the governor and his wife with gifts, a $6,500 Rolex watch, $15,000 worth of catering for their daughter's wedding, golf trips, airplane tickets, trips to Smith Mountain Lake, and many other luxury gifts.
Hey, that's a good friend. And I think a federal jury actually convicted Governor McDonnell of corruption, right?
Yeah, in fact, I was in the courthouse when that happened. It was a pretty exciting moment. But the U.S. Supreme Court later overturned that because it thought the governor didn't do enough in exchange for all of those gifts.
Not enough quid for the quo, eh, Michael?
Or maybe it wasn't enough quo for the quid, either way.
Well, the point is Virginia's got a long history of corruption and no true safeguards. There's no limit to how much money you can give politicians, and neither the legislature nor any state agency has power to investigate alleged wrongdoing or sanction rule breakers.
That's why Virginia consistently scores so low on state rankings from the Center for Integrity, which recently ranked Virginia a depressing 43rd among states in terms of the strength of its campaign finance laws.
Well, as to whether or not it's depressing, Michael, I guess it depends on who you're talking to. But to help you understand the problem and what lawmakers can do about it, we're joined by the president and CEO of the Coalition for Integrity, Shruti Shah. Thanks for coming back on Pod Virginia.
Thank you for having me, both Thomas and Michael. Very pleased to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you back. Let's start with that ranking. I said it's depressing that Virginia ended up at 43rd, but Thomas is right. I guess it's only depressing based on who you're talking to. Explain this ranking. What does it mean that Virginia ranked 43rd? Explain how the rankings work.
So the rankings are like 50 states and DC. So you're talking 43 out of 51, 50 states plus DC. So you're in the bottom 10. So you're really at the bottom. And that's the ranking. The score is also like 55 something. So out of 100. So, below 60, if you go to public school in Arlington, Virginia, at least below 60 is a failing grade. So I could call it a failing grade. It is depressing any which way you look at it, either by score or by rank.
All right, let's talk about that ranking. So which states actually ranked high and what separates them from the states like Virginia who rank low?
That's a very good question. But before we do it, let me just give a sort of a 10-second overview on what the State Campaign Finance Index is really looking at. So what we did is in this first ever State Campaign Finance Index is we analyzed the laws of 50 states and DC, which relate to the powers of these state agencies that regulate campaign finance. It examines whether these agencies have investigative and enforcement authority. It looks at laws on prohibition of campaign coordination, limits on campaign contributions, the disclosure of those contributions, requirements for transparency of funding of independent expenditures and political advertisements, and the availability of this campaign finance information. So obviously, there are some states that did better than others. And what distinguishes them is really, the fact that they have an independent agency which has powers to investigate. They have wide powers to sanction. They have greater transparency of dark money. They have stronger laws on campaign coordinations. They certainly have more disclosure available in terms of campaign contributions on their campaign finance bodies' websites as well. So I would say that's what distinguishes the good states from the bad. But if you're asking me which states actually scored well, then I would say it's Washington, California, Maine that are the top scoring states, and certainly Virginia is in the bottom 10.
So in this most recent General Assembly session earlier this year, there was some discussion about banning campaign contributions from Dominion Energy. This was actually framed as preventing state-regulated industries from making contributions. Looking across other states, is this a trend? Have we seen these kinds of laws being passed by states, other states?
So, as you know, that Virginia is only one of 5 states that does not have limits on contributions to candidates and political parties. So most states do have limits on contributions. When you're talking about receiving money from corporations or public utilities, it's quite a complicated issue because Dominion Energy, which you mentioned, for instance, has a history of giving money to legislators running for office from either side of the aisle. And there have been many public reports which basically allege that Dominion has overcharged customers. I saw one report which says over the last decade, Dominion Energy has overcharged customers by more than $2.3 billion. Another report was saying for residential customers, bills have skyrocketed. They've risen over 25% since 2007. And it does give rise to this perception that corporations influence public policy by giving money to legislators. So that really is the heart of the issue. And Virginia is, again, one of 5 states which has no limits whatsoever. So, again, quite depressing.
I want to look real quick and bring in the Arizona Public Utility Corporation, which their state's equivalent of the SCC actually ruled that it was illegal for the public service utility to give any money to politicians. And they did that bureaucratically. But as soon as that happened, they ended up becoming a target for everybody, Republicans, Democrats, because all of a sudden they couldn't help get reelected, but their opponents could help reelect them. So is it necessarily the right policy choice to focus in on one specific company or subset of companies, or should it apply more broadly so we don't have individual contributors stepping in to fill the gap?
I would say that you're absolutely right, and you hit the nail on the head, that having just limitations on or prohibitions on contributions by corporations is not enough. You need to have reasonable contributions, reasonable limits on contributions by individuals and PACs as well. But that, again, by itself is not enough as well, because you can easily sidestep it by coordinating with the candidates committee. You can also give money to independent spending groups that fund these political ads. There are many ways to sidestep it. The way I look at things in terms of campaign finance reform is it's not just one question that's a silver bullet, but you have to look at an entire package of reforms to make sure that you are able to reduce the perception of the influence of special interests on public policy, and certainly increase transparency and reduce the perception that our politicians are beholden to donors that write the biggest checks.
All right, well then let's talk about some of the specific campaign finance laws that should be included in a package. So one, why should anyone care that Virginia's got a weak legal framework regulating campaign finance? And what is a better framework that could regulate campaign finance?
So one thing that Virginia needs to have is it needs to have give more powers to the Virginia Board of Elections, right? So Virginia State Board of Elections administers the campaign finance laws, but it does not have the authority to conduct its own investigations or hold public hearings or have subpoena power. It may request that the Attorney General do so. But again, that means that any investigation is restricted to the most egregious cases. It has, again, very, very limited ability to sanction. And by sanctioning, I mean both injunctions and fines. So it has it has no ability to issue injunctions, and fines can only be imposed for some violations, and again, not really very dissuasive fines. So again, you need to expand that ability to fine. Now, Virginia, as you know, has no limits on campaign contributions. That's certainly one area to improve on. It has also very limited rules on campaign coordination, but they don't matter as much because since there are no rules on, there are no limitations on contributions, the rules on coordination really don't matter because you can give as much money as you want. But the other thing that the state needs to improve on is the reporting of contributors to independent expenditure committee. So Virginia does require PACs that make independent expenditures to file quarterly reports that include information about contributions, but it doesn't have that second level of disclosure. So there are no provisions requiring the disclosure of funders of 501c organizations that give money to like independent spenders, or there's no requirement to disclose beneficial owners of LLCs that make contributions to entities that have that really do independent expenditures. So that second level of disclosure, that really disclosure of truly dark money, is not there. And the final most important thing is that while VPAP does provide campaign contribution information, I mean, if you look on the Virginia Board of Elections, the State Board of Elections, the information is not easily accessible. I mean, that really is the responsibility, I would say, of the state. You need to be able to access these reports, and people living in Virginia should be able to access them very easily and sort them in a variety of ways and try to understand what's going on. And again, Virginia doesn't have that.
Well, now, on that last point, Virginia does have an organization with a website called the Virginia Public Access Project, known by most of our listeners as VPAP, that does post all that stuff. And in fact, in this most recent General Assembly session, there was some discussion about doing what you're saying and having the state create a website that's a state website that has all that information. And they came to the conclusion, why reinvent the wheel and spend a lot of money on doing something that already exists? What would you say to that?
Oh my God, they are depending on a nonprofit organization. What if the nonprofit falls? Who's funding them? I mean, again, I have a lot of respect for what VPAP is doing, but again, how are we sure about the quality of information being provided to VPAP? They certainly get the information from the State Board of Elections. And again, there might be certain details. Certainly, journalists have told me that there are some details which they actually can't even get through VPAP, the kind of detail that they're looking for. And how do you outsource the responsibility of the campaign finance agency to an outside nonprofit? That to me inherently seems wrong. And certainly, many have raised questions about how VPAP is funded and whether it's truly impartial and things like that. So while I think VPAP does great work, VPAP could fold. It's a nonprofit organization.
All right, you've said that Virginia is one of 5 states that doesn't limit campaign contributions, but is there data that would suggest what an ideal limit and the permutations thereof should be?
I would say there is data in the sense that we, to score the states, have obviously used a scoring rubric, right? So we have actually decided that we are going to use the federal limits to assign points to states in terms of contribution. So the FEC publishes limits, and you could just use those. I would argue that it's certainly more expensive to run a state campaign than it is to run a federal campaign.
Well, I guess that depends on what state campaign you're talking about and what the election will look like. Let's talk about investigating wrongdoing. Now, your report points out that Virginia has a freestanding agency to oversee campaign finance, but you say it's a problem that that agency does not have the power to investigate wrongdoing or sanctions. Explain why that's important. Like, what would it look like if Virginia did have an agency that had the power to investigate and sanction?
So Virginia, the State Board of Elections doesn't have the power to do so, but it can refer it to the Attorney General. The issue with that is when you refer things to the Attorney General, then you're essentially, when you're outsourcing enforcement exclusively to the Attorney General and the criminal justice system, prosecution is limited to the most egregious cases. So the truth is that, effective enforcement is crucial to deter wrongdoing, but also provide like a meaningful incentive to candidates to abide by the rules. So if you have, like, say, a limited ability to investigate and even more limited ability to issue fines, then it's not going to be enough of a deterrent. If when agencies' enforcement powers are limited, then its ability to compel adherence is also undermined.
So the budget, Shruti, is a statement of priorities, and a lot of this stuff, including studying what needs to be reformed, where the reforms should be, and setting up new agencies, would take money. And because that's a zero-sum game, where should campaign finance reform fall in the list of priorities for legislators? And why is it more important than maybe something else we're already funding or that needs to be funded?
When you look at the decisions that are made at the state level, and particularly when you're looking at what the United States has spent, even in terms of battling the pandemic, a lot of the money has been distributed to states. And this is all taxpayer money. So how this money is spent may be influenced by contributions to a politician's campaign, right? They have great influence. So I think it's in our interest, when I say our interest, I would say in the interest of Virginia voters, to push for campaign finance reform because of the influence it can have on public policy, influence it can have on how money is spent, influence it can have on whether our leaders are acting in our interest in such a tough economic environment, or whether they're acting in whether they're acting for special interests. So, of course, everything costs money, and giving more investigative power and more enforcement power to Virginia State Board of Elections would cost money. But shouldn't this be prioritized? Because we are talking about influence over vast tranches of money that state legislators and state governments have the ability to influence.
All right, one last question before we let you go. I'm wondering if you have heard of any movement among Virginia lawmakers about this. I mean, is anybody, to your knowledge, interested in doing anything about any of this stuff?
This is a tough one. And this question might well be directed to lawmakers that have introduced bills in the past, which have sadly failed. There's that joint subcommittee, and they are certainly looking at it. But I'm hoping that this report and advocacy done by many grassroots groups in Virginia, such as Money Out Virginia, can help push them to actually come up with a plan for campaign finance reform in Virginia in not only the next legislative session, but in the ones afterwards. It might not just be a one and done thing, but we certainly need to move in that direction. We can't be in the bottom 10.
All right. Well, that's a good spot to leave it for this week. That's all we have time for. Shruti Shah at the Coalition for Integrity, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Virginia.
Thank you for having me, both Michael and Thomas.
Pod Virginia is a production of Jackleg Media. Our producer is Arian Ballou. Our social media manager is Emily Cottrell. And our advertising sales manager is David O'Connell.
Find us on Facebook or Twitter. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And hey, write a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show.
We'll be back next week with another episode of Pod Virginia.